Sometime in the early 1880s, if you wanted to find the most chaotic, most profitable, most genuinely alive piece of real estate in the entire American West, you didn't go to San Francisco. You didn't go to Denver. You went to a high, cold, windswept plateau in the mountains of southwestern Montana, about a mile above sea level, where the ground beneath your feet was so saturated with copper and silver and gold that men were pulling more wealth out of a single square mile of earth than most countries generated in an entire year. You went to a place called Butte, and when you got there, what you found wasn't some dusty frontier outpost with a few tents and a saloon. What you found was a fully functioning industrial city, with electric streetcars and opera houses and department stores and immigrant neighborhoods stacked up against each other so tightly you could hear 6 different languages just walking a single city block. You found a skyline of headframes, those tall wooden and steel structures marking the shafts that went thousands of feet straight down into the richest hill on earth, rising above a city that ran 24 hours a day because the mines never stopped. Not for night, not for weekends, not for weather, not for anything. You found saloons, literally hundreds of them, open around the clock, serving miners coming off shift at 2 in the morning, as casually as they served the lunch crowd. You found brothels operating openly within a few blocks of City Hall, a red light district so established and so organized that it paid municipal taxes like any other business. You found robber barons building copper fortunes so enormous they shaped federal politics from a town that most Americans couldn't have located on a map. And if you go to Butte today, you find something that takes a few minutes to fully absorb. You find a city that once held 90,000 people, one of the largest cities between Minneapolis and Seattle at its peak, now holding somewhere around 34,000. You find block after block of empty lots where buildings used to stand, Victorian storefronts with plywood in the windows, streets that feel slightly too wide for the traffic actually using them because they were laid out for a population that doesn't exist anymore. You find, on the north side of the city, a thing called the Berkeley Pit, an open-pit copper mine so massive, more than a mile wide and 1,700 feet deep, that it consumed entire neighborhoods, swallowed whole streets and hundreds of homes, and now sits full of toxic water so acidic it has killed flocks of migrating birds that tried to land on its surface. A poisoned lake in the shape of a crater, sitting right next to a residential city, as a kind of permanent monument to what extraction economies leave behind when they finish extracting. You find a place that is simultaneously one of the most historically rich, architecturally remarkable, culturally layered small cities in the entire American West, and one of the most hollowed out, one of the most structurally damaged, one of the most quietly heartbreaking economic stories anywhere in the country. Butte, Montana is one of the most important cities in American history that almost nobody outside of Montana has ever seriously thought about. And if you find that combination of genuine historical significance and near-total national obscurity as interesting as I do, go ahead and subscribe right now, because this is a story about copper and greed and immigrant labor and corporate monopoly and environmental catastrophe, and honestly about what happens to a place when the entire reason it exists just stops, one day, essentially without warning. Let's get into it. To understand Butte, you have to start with the ground itself, because everything about this city, its founding, its boom, its politics, its culture, its eventual collapse, flows directly from what was buried underneath it. And what was buried underneath it was almost incomprehensible in its scale and concentration. The area that would become Butte was first prospected seriously in the early 1860s, during the wave of Western mining speculation that followed the California gold rush. And in those first years, the strike was decent but not extraordinary. Some placer gold in the creeks, some silver in the hillsides, enough to bring a modest population of miners and speculators, but nothing on the scale of Virginia City or the other big Montana gold camps. For about a decade and a half, Butte was a relatively unremarkable silver mining camp, productive enough to keep people around, but not the kind of place-making national headlines. What changed everything, in a way that almost nobody fully anticipated at the time, was copper. Specifically, it was copper in combination with a transformation happening in the broader American economy during the 1870s and 1880s, the rapid electrification of the country. Thomas Edison's electrical systems, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone networks, the explosive spread of electrical power and telegraph infrastructure across every major American city. All of it required one thing above everything else: copper wire, enormous quantities of it, more than American mines had ever needed to produce before, in the entire history of the industry. And it turned out that the same hills around Butte that had produced decent quantities of silver also sat atop a copper deposit of absolutely staggering proportions. The richest copper deposit, by most measurements, ever discovered in North America, possibly the richest single copper deposit ever discovered anywhere on Earth. When mining engineers started seriously assessing the geology around Butte in the late 1870s and early 1880s, what they found was essentially a mountain of copper ore, a formation so rich and so extensive that serious men with serious credentials started describing it in terms that sounded like exaggeration, but were not. They called it the richest hill on Earth. That phrase, the richest hill on Earth, became Butte's unofficial motto, and for roughly 4 decades it was not a boast but a statement of geological fact. The copper boom that followed is one of the fastest transformations of a piece of landscape in all of American history. In 1880, Butte had a few hundred residents and a modest collection of surface mining operations. By 1890, it had 30,000 people. By 1900, it had 60,000. By its peak in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, some estimates put the population between 80 and 100,000, making it one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the entire West. A city that generated more tax revenue per capita than almost anywhere in the country. A city that built an opera house that hosted world-class performers, that had a red light district famous from San Francisco to New York, that consumed more alcohol per capita than virtually any other American city. A city that, despite sitting at over 5,000 feet elevation in the mountains of Montana, somehow developed the personality and the energy and the raw physical intensity of a mining boomtown, amplified to its absolute maximum possible setting. The physical infrastructure that built up around the mines was unlike anything that had ever appeared in the American West before. The headframes, those tall timber and later steel towers that marked each mine shaft and housed the hoisting equipment that brought ore and men up from underground, multiplied across the hillside until the Butte skyline looked like a forest of industrial towers, 60 or more of them visible at once from certain vantage points, each one marking a shaft going hundreds or thousands of feet straight down into ore-rich rock. Underground, the mines connected into an almost incomprehensible network of tunnels and shafts, thousands of miles of underground workings beneath a relatively small surface footprint, a three-dimensional labyrinth of rock and timber and rail and electrical wiring that, if you laid it all end to end, would have stretched from Montana to New York and back. The men who worked those tunnels, and at the peak, there were tens of thousands of them working in multiple shifts around the clock, operated in conditions of almost Gothic difficulty, extreme heat from geothermal activity in the deeper workings, constant danger from rock falls and gas pockets and flooding, air thick with rock dust that over years and decades accumulated in miners' lungs and killed them with a disease called silicosis, which the company doctors for many years either misdiagnosed or declined to officially attribute to the work, because officially attributing it would have created legal liability. Those miners were not primarily old-stock American-born workers. Butte was built almost entirely by immigrants, wave after wave of them, drawn by wages that, at certain moments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were among the highest available to unskilled and semi-skilled industrial workers anywhere in the country. The Irish came first, and in the largest numbers, so many of them, that certain neighborhoods in Butte were essentially transplanted Irish communities, with the same parish loyalties, the same political allegiances, the same social organizations, the same Catholic parish churches that would have existed in Galway or Cork or County Cork, just relocated to a mile-high plateau in Montana. They were followed by Cornish miners from England's tin and copper districts, who brought with them a generation of hard rock mining expertise and a particular meat-filled pastry, called a pasty, that became so embedded in Butte's food culture that you can still buy them in restaurants and delis in Butte today. A direct culinary through-line from 19th century Cornwall to 21st century Montana. Then came Finns, Slavs, Italians, Chinese, Croatians, Serbs, Mexicans, each group settling into their own neighborhood, building their own churches and social halls and fraternal organizations, creating a patchwork urban culture of extraordinary density and diversity that had absolutely no business existing this deep in the northern Rockies, but existed anyway because the copper underground demanded it. This immigrant labor force was, from the very beginning, in a complicated and often violent relationship with the men who owned the mines. And the story of that relationship is really the political story of Butte, which is as dramatic and consequential as the economic story, and arguably more interesting. Because Butte didn't just produce copper. Butte produced one of the most intense, most sustained, and most consequential labor versus capital conflicts in all of American industrial history, a conflict that shaped national politics, produced some of the most powerful mining companies on Earth, and eventually contributed directly to the regulatory framework that governs American mining and labor law to this day. The Copper Kings, as the men who came to dominate Butte's mines were called, were not subtle figures. The first among them in the modern sense of industrial copper monopoly was a man named Marcus Daly, an Irish immigrant who had started as a miner himself in Nevada before making his way to Butte, and, with backing from a group of California investors, purchasing a silver mine called the Anaconda in 1880. Daly's genius, and it was genuine genius of a particular ruthless strategic variety, was recognizing before almost anyone else that the silver deposits at the Anaconda mine were underlain by copper deposits of incomprehensibly greater value, and that the timing of America's electrical revolution meant that copper was about to become the most valuable industrial metal in the world. He bought out his investors, expanded aggressively, built a smelter town 18 miles away in the valley specifically to process Butte ore, and within a decade had assembled what became the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, a corporate entity that grew so large, so vertically integrated, so politically dominant in the state of Montana that it was eventually referred to, with a mixture of bitterness and awe, simply as the company. Not a company, the company, as if there were only one, because in Montana for much of the late 19th and early 20th century, there essentially was. Daly's rival, and this rivalry is one of the great corporate blood feuds of the Gilded Age, was a man named William Andrews Clark, a Pennsylvania-born entrepreneur who had arrived in Montana before Daly, made money in banking and merchandising before turning seriously to mining, and who combined genuine intelligence and almost limitless ambition, with a personal vanity so extreme that he spent a fortune of his copper millions building a Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, so ostentatiously enormous that Edith Wharton reportedly used it as partial inspiration for her fictional portraits of Gilded Age excess. Clark and Daly hated each other with a consistency and creativity that was almost admirable. Their conflict played out through competing newspapers, each man buying and operating papers in Montana specifically to attack the other and advance their respective political interests, through competing bids for control of Montana's Democratic Party, and most spectacularly, through a U.S. Senate campaign in 1899 in which Clark was accused of bribing the Montana state legislature, which at the time still chose U.S. senators before the direct election amendment, so blatantly and openly that the U.S. Senate itself voted to investigate, found credible evidence of massive bribery, and Clark resigned before he could be expelled, only to be re-elected by a different legislature a few years later and serve out a full term anyway, because this is the Gilded Age and the rules were somewhat flexible. Into this already combustible mix arrived a third Copper King, a man named F. Augustus Heinze, who was arguably the most entertaining and certainly the most legally creative of the three. Heinze, the youngest of the trio, an engineer by training and a gambler by temperament, bought up mining claims strategically positioned adjacent to Anaconda's holdings, and then deployed what became known as the Apex Law, a provision of federal mining law that held that whoever owned the surface point where a mineral vein reached its highest underground, its apex, owned the rights to that vein wherever it went underground, even if it crossed into another miner's claimed territory beneath the surface. Heinze hired the best mining lawyers in the country, filed hundreds of Apex Law claims against Anaconda, and simultaneously cultivated an army of friendly judges in the Butte courts who routinely ruled in his favor, resulting in a years-long legal and political war that kept Anaconda's operations in a constant state of courtroom uncertainty, while Heinze continued mining ore from veins that Anaconda believed it owned. He also cultivated a genuine following among Butte's working miners by positioning himself as a populist champion against the Eastern financial interests backing Anaconda, a framing that was mostly self-serving but not entirely dishonest, because Anaconda really was backed by the Standard Oil money of the Amalgamated Copper Company, and the contrast between Heinze's locally rooted scrappiness and Anaconda's Wall Street connections resonated genuinely with a working-class city that had reason to distrust corporate consolidation. He eventually sold out to Anaconda for a price somewhere between $10 and $12 million, an enormous fortune, walked away to New York where he lost most of it in bank speculation, and left Butte poorer in drama if not in copper. By the time Heinze was gone, Anaconda had essentially won. It controlled not just the dominant mining operations in Butte, but an extraordinary percentage of the entire economic infrastructure of Montana: the smelters, the power companies, the railroads, the newspapers, the banks, and most significantly, the political machinery of the state. For the first half of the 20th century, saying that Anaconda ran Montana was not a conspiracy theory. It was closer to a description of the organizational chart. The company's influence in the state legislature was so pervasive and so openly acknowledged that Montana political scientists sometimes described it simply as the company state, a place where the line between corporate interest and governmental function was thinner than anywhere else in the American political system. It published newspapers in every major Montana city that faithfully advanced its interests and suppressed or spun news damaging to it. It lobbied against, and for decades successfully blocked, meaningful mine safety legislation, environmental regulation, workers' compensation improvements, and any organized labor activity that threatened to increase operating costs or reduce managerial control over the workforce. And the workforce, it needs to be said, did not accept this arrangement passively. Butte's labor history is one of the most sustained and intense in all of American industrial history, and if you want to understand the city's politics and culture across most of the 20th century, you need to understand the Butte Miners Union, which at its founding in 1878 was one of the earliest and, for a time, one of the largest and most powerful mining unions in the country. The relationship between the miners and the companies oscillated across the decades between productive negotiation, during periods when commodity prices were high and the companies could afford to be generous, and open warfare, during periods when the companies pushed back hard on wages or working conditions, and the workers responded in kind. The worst of those conflicts produced genuine violence. In 1914, during a particularly intense period of labor turmoil, amplified by the influence of the radical industrial workers of the world, which had established a strong presence among Butte miners, someone dynamited the Miners' Union Hall on Main Street, essentially destroying the institutional home of organized labor in the city and setting off years of chaos, company takeover of union governance, wildcat strikes, and the kind of low-grade class warfare that made Butte simultaneously one of the most politically active and most politically unstable cities in the West. The federal government eventually intervened in Butte's labor situation during World War I, when copper production was classified as essential war material, and the government had a direct interest in suppressing strikes that threatened to slow output. Federal troops were stationed in Butte. Labor organizers were arrested under wartime sedition laws. The IWW was targeted specifically and aggressively by federal authorities, who considered its anti-war position as dangerous as its labor organizing. And through all of it, the copper kept coming out of the ground, because the ground didn't care about human politics, and the demand for copper wire and copper shell casings and copper everything, in a modern industrial war economy, was essentially limitless. What's remarkable about Butte, setting aside the labor and corporate politics for a moment, and just looking at the city itself as a human place, is how fully and completely it developed into a genuine urban culture despite its geography and its industrial brutality. This was not a company town in the stripped-down, purely functional sense, a row of identical houses next to a processing facility with a company store and nothing else. Butte was a city, architecturally ambitious and culturally dense, in ways that consistently surprise people encountering it for the first time. The Copper Kings poured money into civic architecture, not out of civic-mindedness primarily, but out of competitive vanity, each trying to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication through buildings, and the result was a genuinely remarkable collection of Victorian and Edwardian architecture, courthouses and banks and hotels and office buildings built in granite and brick, at a scale and quality that reflected real wealth rather than frontier improvisation. The hotel culture alone was remarkable. The Finland Hotel, built in 1924, modeled in part on the Hotel Astor in New York, brought a level of luxury accommodation to a Montana mining city that would have seemed absurd anywhere else in the Northern Rockies. The Butte Silver Bow Courthouse, the Columbia Gardens amusement park that Marcus Daly built essentially as a gift to his workers, the theaters and concert halls, The Catholic churches built by and for specific immigrant communities in specific architectural styles that referenced home countries their congregants had often never personally visited. All of it accumulated into a cityscape that was genuinely worth looking at, that had depth and character and historical layering that very few Western cities of comparable size possessed. The bars, naturally, deserve their own mention. Butte at its peak reportedly had more bars per capita than almost any city in America, a statistic that, depending on your perspective, either reflects the hard-drinking culture of industrial mining labor or the entrepreneurial genius of whoever got into the liquor business early in a town where men worked brutal 12-hour shifts and needed somewhere to spend their wages and their downtime. The bars weren't just drinking establishments. They were social institutions, neighborhood anchors, places where specific communities gathered and information circulated, and disputes got settled and deals got made, the Irish in their Irish bars, the Finns in their Finnish halls, the whole social geography of the city mapped onto its drinking establishments in a way that turned the saloon directory into an inadvertent ethnographic survey of Butte's immigrant communities. During Prohibition, which Butte treated with a level of official nonchalance that suggested the city had collectively decided federal alcohol law simply didn't apply to a municipality this far from Washington, and this genuinely in need of a drink, the bars simply went semi-underground. In many cases, not even particularly deep underground, continuing operations with a wink and a practical understanding between local law enforcement and local business that has been documented extensively and was apparently about as secret as the copper mines themselves. The peak of Butte's copper production came in the years surrounding World War I, when the combination of wartime demand and the extraordinary richness of the remaining ore deposits made Butte's output almost obscenely profitable, and when the city's population was at or near its historical maximum. Anaconda by this point had consolidated effectively total control over Butte's mining operations, having absorbed or outlasted all of its major rivals, and the company was by most measurements one of the most powerful industrial corporations in the world, with operations extending well beyond Montana into copper mining in Chile, South America, and smelting and refining operations scattered across multiple continents. Butte was the heart of the operation, the original source of the wealth, and while the company had grown far beyond its Montana origins, the city's economic fortunes remained tightly tied to what Anaconda decided to do with the hill underneath them. The decline, when it came, didn't arrive all at once in a single dramatic crash. It came in stages, over decades, each stage a little harder to recover from than the last, but none of them quite final enough to force the kind of complete reckoning that might have produced a genuine reinvention of the city's economic base, while there was still enough momentum and capital in the local economy to fund it. The first real blow came in the 1920s, when copper prices crashed after the end of World War I demand. Production slowed, employment dropped, and several thousand workers left the city for other opportunities, never to return. Butte recovered partially through the 1920s, but never fully recaptured its pre-war employment levels, and the Great Depression hit it with compounding severity. Copper prices during the Depression dropped to historically low levels. Mine shutdowns proliferated, unemployment in Butte reached devastating proportions, and the city that had once seemed economically invincible suddenly had breadlines and shuttered businesses and an outward migration that stripped away another layer of population that never fully came back. World War II provided a partial reprieve, as it had done for so many American industrial cities, bringing wartime demand back and temporarily restoring employment and purpose to the mines. But the post-war period brought a new and ultimately fatal complication to Butte's underground mining economy, one that came dressed in the language of modernization and efficiency, and which rearranged the relationship between the city and the mine in ways that were genuinely irreversible. That complication was open-pit mining. Underground mining, the kind that had defined Butte since its founding, is expensive, labor-intensive, and increasingly difficult as shafts go deeper and ore grades decline with depth. By the 1950s, Anaconda's engineers had been studying the viability of converting a section of the north side of Butte to open-pit operation, removing the surface rather than tunneling beneath it, using massive machinery and explosives to strip away entire layers of earth and process the resulting rock at much lower cost per ton than underground extraction allowed. The problem, and it is a problem that deserves to be stated clearly rather than buried in the language of economic efficiency, is that the north side of Butte was not empty ground. It was a neighborhood. It was a neighborhood called Meaderville, and before that it had included neighborhoods called McQueen and East Butte, and those neighborhoods had houses and churches and businesses and families that had lived there for generations, and Anaconda bought them all out, relocated the residents, demolished the buildings, and started digging. The Berkeley Pit, as it came to be called, swallowed Meaderville entirely by the 1960s and kept growing. It grew to over 1.5 miles wide. It grew to nearly 1,700 feet deep. It generated far more ore tonnage per year than all the underground operations combined, using a fraction of the workforce, which meant that as the pit grew, employment in Butte's mining sector didn't grow with it. It shrank, sharply and steadily, because open-pit copper mining is fundamentally a machine-intensive, capital-intensive, labor-light operation compared to underground mining. The transition from underground to open pit is probably the single most important reason Butte's population began its long, sustained decline in the post-war period, because the same ground that once required tens of thousands of underground miners working around the clock now required a few hundred equipment operators running enormous diesel shovels and haul trucks. The work didn't disappear. The workers did. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Butte lost population steadily, not catastrophically, in the way that a lot of American industrial cities were losing population during that era, as suburbanization spread and economic geography shifted. It was bad, but manageable. Not yet the kind of existential crisis that would force wholesale reinvention. Then came the 1970s, and the structural shifts in global copper markets that hit Butte, like a delayed detonation of something that had been building for 20 years. Copper deposits in Chile, Peru, Zambia, and other lower-cost producing nations had been developed aggressively during the post-war period, and by the 1970s those operations were producing copper at a cost per pound that American mines, with their higher labor costs, older infrastructure, and lower-grade remaining ore deposits, simply could not match competitively. The American copper industry as a whole entered a sustained crisis period, with mines across the country cutting production, laying off workers, and in many cases shutting down entirely. Anaconda, meanwhile, was facing its own corporate death spiral. The company had made a catastrophic strategic error in the early 1970s by expanding enormously into copper mining in Chile, specifically building and developing the Chuquicamata and other Chilean operations, right at the moment when Salvador Allende's socialist government nationalized the Chilean copper industry in 1971. Seizing Anaconda's Chilean assets without what the company considered adequate compensation, and eliminating at a stroke a major piece of the company's expected future revenue. The Chilean nationalization hit Anaconda financially at exactly the worst possible moment, when global copper prices were volatile, and the company was already carrying significant debt from its expansion investments, and the combination was ultimately fatal to its independence. Anaconda was acquired by the Atlantic Richfield Company, ARCO, in 1977, and ARCO, an oil company that had never been particularly excited about the copper business, shut down the Berkeley Pit operations in Butte entirely in 1982. The shutdown of the Berkeley Pit in 1982 is the moment that, more than any other single event, defines Butte's trajectory from that point forward. Anaconda had employed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 workers in Butte at its final peak. When ARCO shut down operations, that employment essentially evaporated over a matter of months. In a city of roughly 37,000 people that had almost no other significant economic engine. Nothing in Butte's economic base, not retail, not services, not any nascent alternative industry sector, was remotely large enough or fast-growing enough to absorb that volume of skilled industrial workers, losing their primary employment simultaneously. People left. A lot of people left, in the way that people leave a place when the reason for the place existing stops existing, quickly and with the finality that comes from understanding that what happened wasn't a downturn you wait out, but a structural change you can't reverse. Butte's population, which had held around 37,000 through the 1970s, dropped to roughly 33,000 by 1990. It has never meaningfully recovered. Today it sits around 34,000, which sounds almost like stability until you remember that this is a city that once held 90,000 people and was growing, a city that had an infrastructure, a street grid, a building stock, an institutional footprint, designed and built for a population 2.5 times its current size. The gap between the city that Butte was built to be and the city that Butte actually is today is visible everywhere, It's visible in the vacant lots, hundreds of them, where buildings were demolished rather than maintained after they emptied. It's visible in the commercial vacancies along the historic downtown streets, storefront after storefront that once housed department stores and theaters and restaurants, now sitting empty or repurposed into something that fills the footprint without generating the same economic activity. It's visible in the public infrastructure, streets and water mains and civic buildings maintained at considerable cost by a tax base that is a fraction of what it once was, simply because a city of 34,000 people cannot sustain the same infrastructure as a city of 90,000 without either massive external subsidy or the kind of painful triage decisions that most places try to avoid making as long as possible. Then there's the environmental legacy, which is, even relative to everything else Butte carries, genuinely extraordinary in its scale and complexity. A century of industrial mining doesn't go away when the mining does. It leaves behind a landscape saturated with heavy metals, contaminated groundwater, acid mine drainage flowing from hundreds of abandoned shafts, smelter smoke residue deposited in the soil across large areas downwind of where Anaconda's smelting operations ran for decades, and of course the Berkeley pit itself, which after Arco stopped pumping out the groundwater that naturally flows through the mineral-rich rock of the Butte Hill, began filling with water that dissolved the ore minerals in the surrounding rock and became, over the following decades, one of the largest and most toxic bodies of water in the United States. The Berkeley pit today holds about 40 billion gallons of water, with a pH somewhere around 2.5, roughly equivalent to battery acid, and a heavy metal content including arsenic, cadmium, zinc, lead, copper, and sulfuric acid that makes it genuinely lethal to animals that drink it, or spend significant time on its surface. In 1995, a flock of hundreds of snow geese landed on the pit during a migration, and most of them died, their internal organs essentially dissolved by the acidity of the water, an event disturbing enough to receive national press coverage and become a kind of shorthand symbol for what unregulated industrial extraction leaves behind. Butte became a Superfund site, one of the largest and most complex in the country, in 1983, the year after Arco shut down operations, and the remediation process has been ongoing ever since, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and involving years of litigation between Arco and its successor companies, the federal government, the state of Montana, and various tribal nations whose water resources were affected by contamination flowing downstream from the mining area. The pit itself has no near-term remediation solution that's both technically feasible and economically realistic, meaning it will likely sit there for the foreseeable future, being monitored, being slowly treated at the margins, while the water level continues to rise, and the contamination problem neither worsens dramatically nor improves meaningfully. There's actually a critical water level at which the contaminated pit water would begin flowing into the surrounding groundwater system and downstream into the Silver Bow Creek watershed, a level called the critical water level, which Butte Silver Bow and the EPA monitor continuously and which requires active intervention to prevent. The Berkeley pit is not a solved problem. It is a managed, ongoing problem, and it will be for generations. What does all of this mean for the people who still live in Butte? That's the question that tends to get lost in the big historical sweep of rise and fall narratives, and it deserves a serious answer rather than just a rhetorical nod. The people who live in Butte today are, by most measures, people who have chosen to be there, who have made a conscious or at least a deliberate decision to stay in a place with all of these complications, rather than leave for somewhere easier. Butte has an unusually strong local identity, an unusual degree of what you might call civic self-awareness, for a city in its economic position. The people who stay in Butte tend to know the history, take pride in it in a complicated but genuine way, and have a real emotional attachment to the physical place, the architecture, the culture, the particular quality of social life that a century of industrial-era immigration and labor organizing produced, that is harder to define than, "this is where I grew up," but clearly means something beyond just inertia. The historic Uptown, which is what people in Butte call the original Victorian downtown district, has survived in a form that is genuinely impressive given the economic pressures it's been under. Butte's Uptown contains one of the largest intact historic districts of Victorian and Edwardian commercial architecture anywhere in the western United States. Thousands of buildings from the mining peak era, the kind of density and quality of historic built environment that would, in a more economically robust setting, be an enormous tourism asset, the way that similar historic districts in places like Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Galveston, Texas, have become central to those cities' contemporary economic identities. The architecture is genuinely remarkable. The scale of it, the variety of it, the evidence in every ornate facade and copper-clad detail of a moment of extraordinary wealth and civic ambition that didn't survive long enough to be replaced by something uglier. Walking through Butte's uptown on a good day feels like walking through a preserved fragment of the American industrial peak, a place where the built environment still carries the memory of what was here, even as the economy that built it is long gone. There are active preservation efforts, some of them quite serious, working to stabilize and adaptively reuse Butte's historic building stock. And some of those efforts have produced genuine results. The World Museum of Mining, built around the actual surface infrastructure of the Orphan Girl mine shaft, gives visitors an unusually direct physical encounter with the actual equipment and machinery of hard rock mining, and has become a genuine regional attraction. There are brewery tours and mining history tours and walking history experiences that do a respectable job of making Butte's complicated past accessible to the kind of historically curious traveler who finds the combination of labor history, industrial archaeology, immigrant culture, and Gilded Age excess as genuinely fascinating as it deserves to be. Butte has developed a modest but real heritage tourism sector that benefits from the authenticity of its history. The fact that this story actually happened here, in these buildings, on this particular piece of earth, in a way that no reconstruction or historical theme park can fully replicate. But heritage tourism is not a replacement economic engine for heavy industry at scale. It's a supplement, an enhancement, a valuable addition to an economic base that has to have other things sustaining it. And Butte's challenge for the last 4 decades has been precisely that. Identifying and building those other things is enormously difficult in a small, geographically isolated, heavily contaminated city with a decades-long reputation for economic decline. Geographic isolation is a real constraint. Butte sits at the intersection of Interstates 15 and 90, which sounds like strong connectivity, and is relative to its history of having only a single rail connection. But interstate highway access doesn't overcome the basic reality that Butte is a long way from major population centers, and a long way from the kind of urban amenity cluster that tends to attract the knowledge economy employers and the remote work migrants who have been the salvation of some other small western cities in recent decades. Missoula, Montana's university town 2 hours to the west has developed a far more diverse and resilient economy than Butte's over the same time period. Partly because the university itself is an enormous stable employer that doesn't depend on commodity prices, and partly because Missoula's combination of outdoor recreation access and cultural amenities has made it genuinely attractive to the younger, more educated population cohort that the modern economy rewards. Montana Tech, the university that grew out of the Montana School of Mines and still sits in Butte, provides some of the same stabilizing function, but at a smaller scale and without the same magnetic pull of Missoula's combination of natural setting, cultural scene, and university town energy. There's also a conversation that Butte has been having with itself, imperfectly and with considerable difficulty, about what to do with the Berkeley pit specifically as an economic asset rather than purely a liability. The proposal that has come up repeatedly, and that has generated genuine controversy every time it does, is essentially tourist attraction status for the pit, charging visitors to view one of the most spectacular and genuinely awe-inspiring examples of industrial landscape in the country. The pit is, in its weird and terrible way, visually extraordinary. A man-made crater of such enormous scale and such vivid geological character, its walls striped with different mineral formations in shades of orange and red and brown and gray, its toxic water in certain lights an extraordinary shade of turquoise blue, that visitors who pay the current modest fee to stand at the viewing platform routinely describe it as one of the most striking things they've ever seen, in the specific way that genuinely extreme human destruction of landscape is sometimes striking, not despite its horror, but in a complicated relationship with it. There have been proposals to expand pit-related tourism more aggressively, to build better visitor infrastructure around it, to make it a centerpiece of an industrial heritage tourism experience, rather than just a thing that Butte acknowledges and moves past quickly when talking to outsiders. Whether that approach can generate meaningful economic activity without also becoming a kind of morbid spectacle that misrepresents Butte's complicated relationship with its own past is a genuine tension that the city hasn't fully resolved. What's been genuinely interesting to watch over the last decade or so is the degree to which Butte has attracted a certain kind of attention from people who are looking for exactly what Butte has in abundance: authentic historic character, inexpensive real estate, a genuine community rather than a manufactured one, a landscape that is simultaneously damaged and magnificent in ways that resist easy aesthetic categorization. Some artists and creative people have moved to Butte specifically because it offers something that very few places offer: the combination of cheap space, genuine history, and the particular kind of freedom that comes from being in a place that isn't trying to be anything other than what it is. Property prices in Butte remain dramatically lower than comparable-sized cities in the Mountain West, which means that someone who wants to own a genuinely beautiful Victorian house with actual architectural character can do that in Butte for a price that would buy a generic suburban starter home in Missoula or Bozeman. That's a real value proposition for a specific kind of buyer, just not a particularly large segment of the current housing market. Montana's overall economic trajectory over the last 15 or 20 years has been interesting to set against Butte's more difficult path, because the state as a whole has experienced a genuine boom in certain sectors, particularly in the western part of the state where Bozeman and Missoula have grown dramatically, attracting tech workers and outdoor recreation enthusiasts and second home buyers and retirees from coastal cities, and the resulting influx of wealth has transformed the culture and the cost of living of those cities substantially, while leaving Butte somewhat behind the curve of that particular wave of prosperity. Bozeman, which 60 years ago was a modest agricultural and university town, has become one of the fastest-growing cities in the country, with real estate prices that have roughly quadrupled in the last decade, and a startup economy that has no historical precedent in the region. Butte, which is larger, older, historically more significant, and sits roughly an hour east of both Missoula and Bozeman on the interstate, hasn't captured nearly the same share of that growth wave, partly because of the Superfund legacy, partly because of the built environment challenges, and partly because the story that Butte tells about itself, even when told well, is a complicated and somewhat dark story about industrial decline and environmental damage, rather than the clean skies, open spaces, new beginnings story that Bozeman tells effortlessly. There are infrastructure investments that have been made and announced, some of them potentially significant. The Superfund cleanup, while interminably slow and frustratingly incomplete, has genuinely reduced the most acute contamination risks in some areas of Butte, and that cleanup, measured in hundreds of millions of federal dollars flowing through the local economy over decades, has itself been a modest economic stabilizer, employing environmental engineers and remediation workers and support services that wouldn't otherwise be there. There have been periodic attempts to attract manufacturing or technology employers to Butte, with mixed results. A handful